You believe you're an adult, rational, in control, making conscious decisions based on years of experience and accumulated wisdom. But what if I told you that the person navigating your life right now, choosing your relationships, sabotaging your success, reacting to minor slights as if they were existential threats, isn't you at all? It's a child, a wounded, terrified child who never grew up because no one ever taught them it was safe to. And if you're someone who's tired of surface-level psychology that tells you to just be positive, if you want the uncomfortable truths about why you do what you do, hit subscribe now. Because this channel exists for people who want their illusions shattered, not maintained. This is the first video in our Carl Jung Deep Dive series, and what comes next will make this look gentle. Carl Gustav Jung uncovered one of psychology's most unsettling truths. Within every adult lives a child, not a memory, not a metaphor, but a real, breathing psychological entity, an archetype that operates from the shadows of your unconscious, pulling strings you don't even know exist. This inner child doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't care about your career, your reputation, or the persona you've carefully constructed for the world. It acts. It reacts. It sabotages. And it does so with the force of every unprocessed wound, every moment of abandonment, every time you learned that your feelings were too much, too inconvenient, too dangerous to express. Most people spend their entire lives running from this child. They bury it under layers of achievement, distraction, and what society calls maturity. They tell themselves they've moved on, that childhood is just a phase that ended decades ago. But Jung discovered something darker. The more you ignore this child, the more control it has over you. That inexplicable rage when someone criticizes you. The child. That desperate need for validation from people who will never give it. The child. That pattern of choosing partners who abandon you just like someone did long ago. The child. The terrifying part isn't that this child exists. It's that most people will die without ever knowing it was in charge. This video is not therapy. It's not a gentle reassurance that everything will be okay if you just think positive thoughts. This is confrontation. Because the only way out of this invisible prison is to look directly at the bars. Jung didn't create comforting theories. He excavated the darkest corners of the human psyche and brought back maps for those brave enough to descend. And what he found about the inner child, its power, its manifestations, its potential for both destruction and liberation, is knowledge that most people are too afraid to face. But you're still here, which means some part of you, perhaps that child itself, knows it's time. So let me ask you directly, are you ready to meet the child who has been running your life? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And everything you thought you knew about yourself will shatter. Let's begin. Carl Jung didn't deal in pleasant metaphors or self-help platitudes. His work was rooted in something far more primal, the collective unconscious, a realm of psychological structures that exist beneath individual experience, shaping human behavior with a force that transcends logic, culture, or personal history. Among these structures, these archetypes, few possess the raw power of the inner child. This is not nostalgia. This is not your fond memories of summer afternoons or birthday parties. The archetypal child Jung identified is a living presence within your psyche, an active center of emotional energy that continues to operate regardless of how many years have passed since you were actually a child. It exists now, in this moment, influencing how you perceive threats, how you respond to rejection, how you seek connection, and how you sabotage the very things you claim to want most. Jung observed that this child serves as a symbol of the self in formation, simultaneously representing the beginning of the individuation journey and the unrealized potential still waiting to emerge. It carries within it the purest aspects of human nature: spontaneity, creativity, wonder, sensitivity. The capacity to feel life as sacred, mysterious, full of infinite possibility, but it also carries something else. something we spend our entire adult lives trying to escape. The wounds, every moment of abandonment, every experience of rejection, every time you expressed a need and were met with anger, dismissal, or cold indifference. Every instance where you learned that to be vulnerable was to be hurt, that to ask for love was to be humiliated, that to show your true self was to risk annihilation. These aren't just memories stored somewhere in your brain. They are living psychological material, actively shaping your reality right now. When a grown adult dissolves into rage over a minor criticism, that's not an overreaction. That's the inner child experiencing the criticism as proof that they are fundamentally unlovable, just like they learned decades ago. When someone with every external marker of success feels chronically empty, that's not ingratitude. That's the inner child still waiting for the validation that was never given. When you find yourself in the same toxic relationship pattern for the 5th time, that's not bad luck. That's the inner child unconsciously recreating the dynamics it knows, desperately trying to get a different ending to an old story. Jung was unambiguous about this. Ignoring the inner child is psychological amputation. Any attempt at growth, healing, or self-actualization that bypasses this archetypal presence is doomed to fail. Because you cannot transcend what you refuse to acknowledge. The inner child doesn't respect your career achievements. It doesn't care about your social status or how well you've convinced others that you're fine. It simply persists. And when it's denied, it moves into the shadow, that realm of the psyche where everything we reject about ourselves goes to gain power. From the shadow, it manifests in ways we don't recognize or understand. Emotional outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. Inexplicable anxiety with no clear source. The inability to maintain boundaries. Compulsions we can't explain. Relationships we destroy without meaning to. But here's what makes Jung's understanding revolutionary. This child doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be healed in the traditional sense, as if it were a broken part to be repaired. It needs to be seen, recognized, given legitimate space within your psychological landscape. And this is just the surface. In the next video in this series, we're going into Jung's concept of the shadow, that part of your psyche where the rejected child lives, and how it's sabotaging your relationships right now without you knowing. You'll want to watch that immediately after this one. This is where most people get it wrong. They approach inner child work as if it were about returning to the past, reliving trauma, or indulging in emotional regression. But Jung's vision was different. He wasn't interested in you becoming childlike. He was interested in you becoming whole. And wholeness requires integration, the conscious acknowledgement and incorporation of every aspect of yourself you've learned to hide, deny, or condemn. The question is not whether your inner child exists. It does. The question is, which face is it showing you? Because this archetype doesn't manifest the same way in everyone. Jung identified multiple expressions of the inner child, each with distinct patterns, needs, and ways of hijacking your adult life. Understanding these faces is the first step toward recognizing when you're being controlled by forces you can't see. Let's look at them now. Because once you know what to look for, you'll see these patterns everywhere. In yourself, in others, in the entire structure of modern suffering. Jung's genius was in specificity. He didn't just point to the inner child and leave it as an abstract concept. He mapped its territory. He identified the distinct ways this archetype expresses itself, each creating entirely different patterns of suffering and self-sabotage. These aren't rigid categories. They interpenetrate, overlap, shift based on context. But recognizing them gives you something most people never have: the ability to see the invisible mechanism controlling your behavior. Let's start with the most common and the most devastating. The wounded child. This is the child who learned too early that the world is not safe, that expressing needs leads to punishment, that vulnerability invites attack, that love is conditional, unpredictable, or simply unavailable. This child carries explicit trauma, abuse, abandonment, violence, but also implicit trauma. The thousands of micro-rejections, the emotional neglect, the constant invalidation of feelings. The message that who you are is fundamentally wrong. When this child runs your adult life, it manifests in predictable but painful ways. You experience fear of intimacy because closeness feels like a setup for inevitable abandonment. You maintain hypervigilance in relationships, constantly scanning for signs of rejection, interpreting neutral behavior as proof you're about to be discarded. You struggle to trust because trust led to pain. You may find yourself in codependent dynamics where you give everything to avoid being left, or in avoidant patterns where you leave first to protect yourself from the pain of being abandoned. Criticism feels like an existential attack rather than feedback. Authority figures trigger a strange mix of desperate seeking and resentful rebellion. You feel chronically empty no matter what you achieve or acquire. The wounded child makes you react to the present as if it were the past. A partner's bad mood becomes proof they don't love you. A delayed text message confirms your fear that you're forgettable. A professional setback validates the belief that you're fundamentally inadequate. This is not weakness. This is not immaturity in the pejorative sense. This is the direct manifestation of psychological material that was never processed, never witnessed, never given space to exist without shame. The eternal child, puer aeternus. Where the wounded child lives in the pain of the past, the eternal child lives in escape from it, and from all the demands of adult existence. This is the part of you that refuses to grow up. Not because you're lazy or irresponsible, but because growing up has been unconsciously coded as a death of the self. The eternal child seeks constant novelty, immediate pleasure, effortless admiration. It has a visceral aversion to commitment, routine, or anything that feels like constraint. It wants the magic of childhood, the infinite possibility, the freedom from consequence, without recognizing that such a state was never real to begin with. In adult life, this manifests as chronic procrastination on anything that requires a sustained effort. Unstable relationships where you're intensely present until the inevitable boredom or difficulty arrives, at which point you vanish. A pattern of starting projects with enthusiasm and abandoning them when they require discipline. You might feel that being an adult is a prison, that responsibility is soul-crushing, that the real you is being suffocated by the demands of ordinary life. Jung didn't view this as moral failure. He saw it as vital childhood energy that never found a mature channel for expression. The problem isn't that you want freedom, creativity, or possibility. These are legitimate needs. The problem is that the eternal child believes these things can only exist in the absence of commitment, structure, or the acceptance of limitation. So you remain perpetually on the verge of the relationship that would fulfill you, the career that would express your gifts, the life that would finally feel real, but never actually arriving. Because arrival would mean accepting that magic doesn't exist, that you're not special in the way you need to be, that the parent who never truly saw you will never come, the divine child. This is the face most people never meet, because to access it, you must first navigate through the territory of the wounded and eternal child. The divine child represents your deepest creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential. It's the part of you that still perceives existence as sacred, mysterious, and pregnant with meaning. It holds your capacity for genuine wonder, authentic compassion, and the creative force that Jung believed was essential to individuation. This child isn't naive. It's wise in ways the rational mind cannot comprehend. It speaks through symbols, dreams, and sudden insights. It's the source of artistic inspiration, spiritual experience, and those rare moments when life feels profoundly right. But here's the tragedy. In most people, this child is suffocated by the pain of the other two. The wounded child's fear and the eternal child's escapism create so much internal noise that the divine child's voice becomes inaudible. When you lose access to this aspect, life becomes mechanical. You feel disconnected from meaning, purpose, or any sense that what you do matters beyond mere survival or social obligation. Creativity dries up. Intuition fades. You go through the motions, increasingly aware that something essential is missing but unable to name what it is. Now, if you're recognizing yourself in one or more of these faces, if you're starting to see the patterns that have been running your life, you need to subscribe right now, because we're just getting started with Jung's map of the psyche. Next week, I'm releasing a video on the shadow archetype and how your rejected inner child becomes the saboteur in your relationships. This is a series, and each video builds on the last. Don't miss what's coming. Jung believed most adults live under the dominion of the wounded child, reacting to the present through the lens of the past, seeking in partners the parents they never had, recreating childhood dynamics in adult contexts, trapped in patterns they consciously reject but unconsciously perpetuate. And this isn't a character flaw. It's not a sign that you're broken beyond repair. It's the natural consequence of an archetype operating without awareness. When you don't know the child is there, you can't help but be controlled by it. But here's the shift. When you can identify which child is in charge at any given moment, when you can say, this rage isn't proportional to what just happened. This is the wounded child responding to old pain. Or, this urge to quit comes from the eternal child avoiding difficulty. You reclaim something crucial. Agency, the ability to choose a different response. Not by repressing the child, but by developing something most people never build. An internal adult capable of meeting the child's needs in a way the external world never could. And that's exactly what we need to explore next. Because recognizing the child is only the beginning. The real work, the work that actually changes your life, lies in what Jung called developing the internal paternal ego, the parent you become for yourself. Before we talk about healing, we need to understand why this wound runs so deep. Why the inner child doesn't just exist but actively sabotages. Why integration feels impossible. Why most people would rather stay fragmented than face what they've buried. The answer is simple and brutal. We were taught to hide it. From the earliest moments of consciousness, children receive a clear message about which emotions are acceptable and which are dangerous. Crying is weak. Needing comfort is shameful. Being too sensitive is a flaw that must be corrected. Depending on others makes you a burden. This isn't usually explicit abuse, though for many it is. More often, it's the ambient emotional education of a culture that has pathologized vulnerability and worshipped a particular vision of strength. Self-sufficient, emotionally controlled, independent, rational. So we learn to wear masks. We construct a persona, a socially acceptable self designed to navigate the world without triggering rejection. We become the responsible one, the strong one, the successful one, the one who never needs anything from anyone. And beneath these masks, the child we exiled, still feeling, still needing, still hurting. Jung observed that this repression, done under the guise of maturity, is one of the central causes of modern psychological suffering. Because repression doesn't eliminate the unwanted material, it just forces it into the unconscious, where it gains power. What we try to ignore doesn't disappear. It transforms. Repressed anger becomes chronic anxiety. Ignored needs become compulsions. Stifled vulnerability emerges as addiction, psychosomatic illness, relationship sabotage, or the vague sense that you're living someone else's life. The masks take familiar forms, and you probably recognize them. The mask of the caregiver, always attending to others' needs, never your own, because you learned early that your value lies in usefulness, that love must be earned through service, that your own needs are too much. The mask of strength, the person who never asks for help, never admits pain, solves everything alone, because showing vulnerability once led to rejection or mockery, and you swore it would never happen again. The mask of achievement, constantly performing, accomplishing, impressing, trying to prove your worth to parents who may have never truly seen you, seeking external validation to fill an internal void that no achievement can actually touch. These strategies make sense. They protected you when you were genuinely powerless. They helped you survive environments where showing your true self was unsafe. But survival strategies that work in childhood become prisons in adulthood. The more energy you invest in maintaining these masks, the greater the distance between who you are and who you pretend to be. And this gap, this split, is where the suffering lives. You feel exhausted for no clear reason, empty despite external success, disconnected in your most intimate relationships because no one actually knows you, they only know the mask. You try to fill the void with consumption, achievement, substances, or spirituality that never quite reaches the wound, because nothing external can heal what's happening internally. The inner child doesn't need a better career or a perfect partner or a spiritual awakening. It needs someone inside you to finally turn around, look at it, and say, "I see you. I'm here now. I'm not leaving." That voice, that presence, is what Jung called the internal paternal ego, and developing it is not optional if you want to stop being controlled by unconscious forces. It's the only path to freedom, and it begins not with strength, but with the radical act of self-witnessing. Let's talk about how to build it. If the inner child is the wound, the internal paternal ego is the answer, but not in the way most people think. This isn't about becoming harder, more disciplined, or getting over your sensitivity. It's the opposite. It's about developing within yourself the capacity to be both, the child who feels and the adult who can hold that feeling without drowning in it. Jung's concept of the internal paternal ego is radical because it shifts responsibility. You stop waiting for the world to give you what you needed as a child. You stop seeking in romantic partners the unconditional love you deserved from parents. You stop performing for validation you'll never receive. Instead, you become it, the stable presence, the protective force, the source of the nurturing your child's self was denied. This is not self-indulgence. This is psychological sovereignty. Imagine you receive criticism at work. Immediately you feel a wave of emotion, shame, rage, the impulse to defend yourself or withdraw completely. In that moment, the wounded child has been triggered. It's experiencing the criticism as confirmation of its deepest fear. You are inadequate, unwanted, fundamentally flawed. Most people react from this place. They either lash out or collapse. The emotion controls them because they've never developed the capacity to observe it without becoming it. But with a developed paternal ego, something different happens. You notice the disproportionate emotional response. You recognize it. This isn't about the feedback I just received. This is the child reacting to old pain, to every time I was told I wasn't enough. And then, and this is the crucial shift, you speak to it internally. I see you. I know that hurt, but we're safe now. This isn't that. I've got us. This isn't intellectual. It's not about rationalizing away emotion or convincing yourself the pain isn't real. The pain is real, but you're developing the capacity to hold it, to provide for yourself what wasn't provided then. Witness, validation, protection. Over time, this changes everything. The child stops needing to scream for attention through sabotage because it knows it's being heard. Emotional reactions become less volatile because there's an adult present who can regulate. You stop seeking from others what you've learned to give yourself. This is the essence of reparenting, not going back to fix the past, but creating in the present a new internal relationship that makes the past less powerful. It requires practice. Daily, moment-by-moment practice. When anxiety arises, instead of pushing it away or being consumed by it, you pause. What is the child afraid of right now? And you answer it with presence, not logic. When you feel the urge to seek validation from someone who will never give it, you pause. What am I actually needing? Can I give this to myself first? When you catch yourself in a familiar self-destructive pattern, you pause. Which child is running this show? And what would the adult I'm becoming do instead? This is not easy work. It goes against everything you were taught about strength, independence, and what it means to be an adult. But it's the only work that actually heals. Because the child doesn't need you to be perfect. It needs you to be present. It doesn't need you to have all the answers. It needs you to stop abandoning it every time things get difficult. And this internal work, This dialogue between your adult self and your inner child is the foundation for everything else Jung teaches about individuation. In our next video, we're diving into active imagination, Jung's technique for actually having these conversations with your unconscious. It's powerful, and most people do it wrong. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And the moment you commit to that, to showing up for yourself the way no one else ever fully could, everything begins to shift. The relationships change because you're no longer trying to extract from others what you've learned to provide for yourself. The anxiety decreases because the child feels safer. The patterns break because the unconscious no longer needs to repeat them to get your attention. You become, for the first time, whole. Not healed in the sense of having no pain, but integrated in the sense of no longer being at war with yourself. This is what reparenting actually means. And it's what we need to explore in depth now. The practical, moment-by-moment work of becoming your own parent. Time doesn't heal wounds that remain unacknowledged. It just gives them more years to operate in the dark. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for healing to arrive from outside. The right relationship, the perfect therapist, the breakthrough moment that finally makes the pain stop. But Jung understood something most psychological approaches miss. External reparenting can only go so far. At some point, you must learn to give yourself what wasn't given. This is reparenting. And it's not a metaphor, it's a concrete psychological practice that changes the structure of your inner world. To reparent yourself means to consciously become the adult you needed when you were a child. Not to infantilize yourself or indulge in emotional regression, but to provide internally what was absent externally. Validation, safety, boundaries, and unconditional presence. This begins with something most people have never actually done. Listening to the child without agenda. Not the listening that tries to fix, minimize, or rationalize away the pain. Not the listening that says, "That was a long time ago, you should be over it by now." But the listening that simply witnesses, "This hurt you. This was real. This mattered." The wounded child doesn't need solutions. It needs to be believed. It needs someone, even if that someone is you, to confirm that its pain makes sense, that its fear wasn't irrational, that its need for love wasn't excessive. This simple act of internal validation has more power than most therapeutic interventions. Because what creates psychological wounding isn't just the traumatic event, it's the lack of witness. The child who is hurt and then told they're too sensitive, that it wasn't that bad, that they need to toughen up, learns something devastating. Their inner reality cannot be trusted. Reparenting reverses this. You become the one who says, "Your reality is valid. Your feelings make sense. You weren't wrong to need what you needed." But listening is only the beginning. Reparenting also requires establishing boundaries, both internal and external. Internally, this means recognizing when the wounded child is driving behavior that harms you, when it's seeking validation from people who will never provide it, when it's reenacting old dynamics in new relationships, when it's choosing short-term relief over long-term well-being. The internal parent doesn't shame these impulses, but it does intervene. I know you want to reach out to them again. I know you're hoping this time will be different, but I'm not letting you do that anymore. Not because you're bad, but because I'm protecting you now. This is not repression, this is care. It's saying, you no longer have to beg for love from people who can't give it. You no longer have to diminish yourself to be accepted. You no longer have to prove your worth through self-abandonment. Reparenting also involves developing the capacity for self-soothing, not through avoidance or numbing, but through genuine presence in moments of distress. When anxiety spikes, instead of reaching for the usual escape mechanisms, you practice staying. I feel you panicking. I'm here. We're going to breathe through this together. When shame arises, instead of spiraling into self-attack, you interrupt. I see you feel exposed right now. But you're not wrong for being human. We're okay. These sound simple. But for someone who has spent decades running from their own inner experience, they're revolutionary. Over time, and this doesn't happen quickly, the child begins to trust you. The panic decreases because it knows you won't abandon it in crisis. The shame loses its grip because it no longer operates in isolation. The patterns shift because the child no longer needs to control through sabotage. And something else emerges. Something most people have forgotten exists. The divine child, the creative force. The part of you that isn't defined by wounds, but by potential. When the wounded child feels safe, it steps back, and what was always there, but buried under layers of pain, finally has space to breathe. This is where life stops being about survival and becomes about something else entirely. Not happiness in the shallow sense, but aliveness, presence, the capacity to feel deeply without being destroyed by feeling. This is the promise of Jung's vision. Not that you'll stop being sensitive, stop feeling pain, or transcend your humanity, but that you'll finally be able to inhabit yourself fully without the constant war between who you are and who you think you should be. The transformation doesn't happen because the pain disappears. It happens because you finally stop treating your own inner child like everyone else did, with neglect, impatience, or demand that it just be different. You become, at last, the one who stays. Something shifts when this child is finally, truly seen. Not fixed, not transcended, just witnessed, held, allowed to exist without shame. The anxiety that once consumed you, always scanning for threats, always preparing for abandonment, begins to quiet. Not because the world became safer, but because you're no longer navigating it as a terrified child desperately trying to avoid pain. The relationships that used to repeat the same painful patterns start to change. Not because you found better people, but because you stopped choosing from a place of emptiness, stopped trying to extract from others what you've learned to provide for yourself. The creative force you thought you'd lost, the one that got buried under years of having to be practical, responsible, acceptable, suddenly resurfaces. Because the divine child, which was always there, finally has space to breathe. This is not healing in the sense of becoming undamaged. It's integration. It's wholeness. It's the end of the war between the parts of yourself you've been taught to accept and the parts you've been taught to exile. Jung said the child archetype is a symbol of totality. When it's integrated, when the wounded child is seen, the eternal child is channeled, and the divine child is accessed, you stop living fragmented. You stop needing to wear masks because you're no longer afraid of what lives beneath them. You stop seeking completion in others because you've finally met yourself. You stop running from your sensitivity and start recognizing it as the very thing that makes you capable of depth, creativity, and genuine connection. This is the turning point, and it doesn't come from outside. Not from a course, not from a relationship, not from finally achieving enough to prove your worth. It comes from the single most radical act available to you. Turning inward with courage and saying to the child you've spent your entire life ignoring, "I see you. I'm here for you. I will not abandon you anymore." That gesture, that commitment, changes everything. Because the child doesn't need you to be perfect. It just needs you to finally show up. And when you do, when you truly do, it stops sabotaging. It stops screaming. It stops repeating the patterns that have defined your entire existence. And what emerges is not a life free of pain, but a life where pain no longer runs the show, where you can feel deeply without being destroyed by feeling, where you're present not because you've transcended your wounds, but because you've finally learned to hold them. This is freedom, not the absence of the child, but the integration of it. And once you cross this threshold, there's no going back. Because you finally understand what Jung meant when he said that the child is the key to the self. Not the problem to solve, but the doorway to everything you've been searching for. The question is, are you ready to walk through it? Now I want to hear from you. At what moment in your life did you realize your inner child was running the show? When did you first see the pattern? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And if this hit you, if you felt that recognition, here's what you need to do. Subscribe to this channel right now. Not just because you found this helpful, but because this is the beginning of a complete series on Carl Jung's psychology. Next week, we're going into the shadow, the part of your psyche where the rejected inner child lives and how it's destroying your relationships. Then we're covering active imagination, the anima/animus, and the full individuation process. This is a roadmap. Each video builds on the last. If you want to understand why you are the way you are, you need all of it. Hit that subscribe button, like this video so more people who need to hear this actually see it, and share it with someone who's still fighting battles that started decades ago. Your transformation doesn't end here. It's just beginning. I'll see you in the next one.